before we get started on the discussion on the HVLP guns and why even the inexpensive ones, Harbor Freight or otherwise, they're good for DIY intermittent use. And you'll hear me say again, it's not the real high-end ones, but they're very doable and they work very good as long as you know a few things, and I'll go through everything with you. But where I wanted to start with this is when we were out at this little club that we have, and we're talking and somebody criticizes the guns, and then they show me like a wood project or something, and I look at it and I thought, okay, let's start, before we get into the HVLP, let's start with the fact you have to have everything prepped real well. So that means you have to have sanded it correctly and sanded it well, and sometimes it can be a little bit of a pain. So let's just take a flat board, for instance, and whether you start with 60 or 80 or 120, that's up to you depending on the wood surface. If you want a general idea, let's say something's not all that great that I bought and I have this board sitting here, I start with 80 and I go to 120, I go to 180, 220, 320, and a lot of times I'll stop there if I'm putting a film finish on something because it's really all you need. If I'm going to do an oil finish, okay, then I go from 320 to 400 to 500 and maybe even 800. It all depends on the project, but generically speaking, what I was saying about the sanding, you could kind of stop around 320 if it's a film finish. Now, so I take a look at this wood project that he had, and so I started telling him about, he wasn't prepping it right. And when you go from one grit to another, you want to clean it off. Don't leave the remnants and the residue of the 80 grit when you start sanding with 120, and then go from 120 to 150 or 180. I mean, you want to clean the wood off real well before you start your next sanding. And if you just do those simple things, your finish is going to turn out a lot better. And what's the difference between a mediocre finish and an outstanding finish? It's just a little more time. That's the only difference. Now, the other thing that you can do to help out is at the dollar store, get yourself a pair of reading glasses, like 2.5 or 3 times. Just pick them up, they're $1, and use those to take a look at that wood surface and see when you're done sanding with, like let's say you start with 80 grit and then you clean it off real good, you sand with 120. Clean it off real good and look at it. Did you get out all those 80 grit marks? If you didn't, keep sanding. Okay, now, then you clean it off real good and then you go to 150 or 180. And then again, when you're done, clean it off real well, take a look at it with those magnifiers on. It's a real simple little trick that I use a lot of times, and it will let you know if you've gotten the previous grits, scratches out of it. Take these simple steps, then start worrying about the finishing. Okay, let's change the conversation over and let's talk about the HVLP now. Now, mine is right here. Now, this is an inexpensive gun. This one was made by Cobalt, and I've got 2 of these. The other one is just another no-name brand one, and I use them for 2 different reasons. Now, this one I use for lacquer and varnish and kind of like top coat material like that. The other one was used for latex paint, and I had gotten it at a garage sale, so that's why I just keep it that way, just for the latex. You don't have to. If they're cleaned out well, of course, you can use them for different products. So let's talk about this one briefly for a minute, and then I'm going to show you a diagram and walk you through it in a simple way. So first of all, you got this big compressor. Now, ideally, it'd be nice to have a dedicated air line, and you don't use it for anything else other than spraying finishes. A lot of people don't. Now, I do, and mine runs through kind of like this ABS piping, and it runs over to a big canister filter, and then from the canister filter, it goes through a dedicated hose and up into here. Now, that's me, because for a while I was doing a lot of spraying on wood products. I don't want any contamination. I don't want any condensation in the lines or anything like that. And I've got a pretty decent setup for keeping condensation out. A lot of people don't. So out at the group where we meet, we sat around and we talked about it. Now, one of the first considerations or things that I would caution you on and tell you to do, buy some disposable filters, and don't buy just anything. The ones like out at Harbor Freight, the paper material that are in these are incredibly poor quality, and you'll start getting stuff off that starts to plug up the gun and you start having problems. Now, I get mine from a place called TCP. I will always leave you the links below. Same thing with the regulator. Some of the guys out of the club have no problems using the regulator, which is attached here. You can get that out at Harbor Freight, and this will help set your working pressure to the gun. Why do I do it that way? Well, depends on how many feet of hose you have, and I've got a big canister, filter, and from there it runs through all this length of hose and it runs up to the gun. Well, there is a PSI drop. So rather than always going back over and fiddling with it there where the big canister filter is, I put this inline right here, this inline pressure regulator. It has a knob on it, and I'm going to show you a diagram in a minute, and I can adjust it to the working pressure that I need. Then the rest of it are the settings up here on the gun. And I'm going to go over that, but I'm going to show you on a dry erase board a diagram I drew, because you can always pause the video, draw it out yourself to just trigger your memory. But this is how I set mine up. It works fantastic on any finished work that I do right now. So, all right, so which should you buy, which should you not buy? Well, that depends. You got DeFilbus, you got Iwata, you got Pache, you have all these different spray guns out there. And then people will tell you, the more inexpensive ones are crap, they're no good and all that. Well, for a DIY person, intermittent use, I found that they work great. As long as you know how to set them up, they will work fine. And as long as you are aware to try to keep as much contamination out of coming up into the gun as possible. So, like I said, ideally a dedicated line. You got a canister filter, and then from there your air hose runs over up into here. You got a pressure regulator here to set your pressure. One more. Whether you put this before or after, different people do it differently. That's up to you. But I got, let's call this the secondary filtering before it goes into the gun, and it's a good one. And I don't have any impurity problems. So, I don't know. For me, it's a great setup. Okay, so let me show you the diagram, and I'm going to hold it up while we continue the conversation on this HVLP. Now, the other thing you can buy, mine came with this stand. You don't need it because it's got a hook here. You can just reach up and hook it wherever. But if you wanted to, you can also use the stand for it if you chose to buy the stand. Not something that you need, but that's the reason why it's here. Okay, let me show you the diagram. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zoom in on this while I talk for a minute, but this is going to show you what each one of these things are for. So I got my cup up on top. That's where you would put your material in there. And then you'll see there's two knobs on the side. One will control the fan. I can make the spray come out like a dot almost, or I can make it come out incredibly wide. So that's your fan control. Now the other one I put down, deals with the volume of material. Now that's how much material you want coming down into this spray gun, and so that helps you to figure out what you need. Now it's best to spray this up against a piece of cardboard or something where you can see that fan pattern and you can see the material coming out, and then you can make your adjustments. Now on the trigger part where you pull it, when you first start to pull it, it's only air that's going to come out. And then as you pull that trigger back more, the material comes down, it starts to atomize, and then it comes out and it creates the pattern that you have set. So that's what those controls up on top are for. And you just have to set these. They're not hard. You just need to practice against something in order to get them correct. So then coming down to the very bottom, you're going to see there's another one down on the bottom. Let me see what I labeled it. It's right here where my finger is, air volume control. Now, I leave that wide open and I don't worry about it because I've got my pressure and everything set below there on the pressure regulator that you see that's below the filter. So, and then you got the air inlet where that's where your hose is coming up and hooking into the bottom of your spray gun. Now, there's a question on here that relates to, well, when you get these, what kind of tips come with them? Well, you've got a couple of different sizes. You got 1.4 and you got 1.8, and somebody told me, what's the difference? Well, to keep it as simple as possible, 1.4 I would use for thin material, the varnishes, the lacquers, things like that if you're spraying paint thinner for whatever reason, or lacquer thinner through it, or whatever you're doing, depending on the project, that you're using. So for thinner materials. Now, that 1.8, I would tell you, is for thicker materials. Maybe you got a little bit of watered down latex in there. It doesn't have to be too watered, but so the 1.8 is for larger viscosity or thicker materials, I'll say. Okay, so the question is how do I set my working pressure back at the gun, like it shows you down here? I set mine between 35 and 40 with these generic, spray guns, these HVLPs. Now for me, it works totally fine. It works great. If you want a good starting point, use 35 or 40 and you can adjust it from there, up or down. And then you start playing around, like I said, with your volume of material and your pattern that you want. I mean, you're not going to want that dot pattern, but you can start off that way and you can start backing out the screw until you start to get that fan. And how much of a fan do you want? If you're doing like a great big picnic table or something, you'll probably want the fan fairly open and wide. A lot of times I'm not. I'm doing smaller projects, so I want my fan a little bit more condensed than that, and that's how you would control that. What do I do when I'm done spraying? I take the material that I have in the cup and I pour it back. And then I rinse it out, and I got one of the throwaway brushes from out at Harbor Freight, and I clean it out real good, let's say with lacquer thinner, whatever you're doing, empty it out. Then I put more lacquer thinner in there, and I turn around and I hold the gun wide open, and I just spray lacquer thinner through it. And it pretty much will clean out the entire internal workings of the gun. And a lot of people say that's good enough, and they'll go on and then, they'll pull it back for the next project. Now, a lot of times I don't do that. I have a little Tupperware basin where I put lacquer thinner or whatever cleaning material, and I tear the gun apart. I clean out the needles. I wash the gun out. You get little brushes and stuff that come in the kit along with these guns. So I keep it incredibly clean, and then that way I know it'll perform flawlessly next time. So there's a difference of opinion here. Some people will disagree with me saying you don't have to do that if you run enough cleaning fluid through it. I don't think it takes that much time. I take it apart, I clean it up, and then I reassemble it, and I wait for the next time, and I know that it's going to work perfectly fine. That's my answer. Also in the kit, you're going to get like this spanner wrench, and that will help you snug up like the little bolt on the tip of the gun and different parts of that particular gun, along with what looks like pipe cleaning brushes, and that helps you. So all these things, once you do this a few times, it's a snap, and you can do it quickly. And I think it's just better all the way around to keep the gun as clean as I possibly can. So how exactly does the HVLP work? Well, from this cup, the fluid's going to come down into the gun, and as you pull that trigger, remember when you first pull it, it's just air, and then when you pull it more, that material is going to come down into the very tip of the gun, and it creates that spray pattern, and that's where it atomizes at and shoots out. So the other important thing to remember on here is if you take a close look, let me see if I can zoom in on this. You see those little holes that are there? I also unscrew this cap on the top, and I clean it out with that lacquer thinner, mineral spirits or whatever, and I run like a little needle or something through all those little holes. Because it can plug up on you there, and then people will go see this HVLP is just a piece of junk, and they'll want to get rid of it because they think it's just junk. But it's just a matter of knowing to keep everything clean, and all these, and especially these little holes on the front, they can become gummed up easy. So make sure when you tear this apart and you unscrew this, and here, let me just do it. All right, so on this one, I'm just going to unscrew it. Okay, and you'll see right there, this is where you would use the spanner wrench, and you would loosen this and take all this out and clean up everything real good with lacquer thinner, including, it's like a needle, kind of like a long piece of needle valve or a needle in there, and I keep it all real clean. That way this whole thing, it triggers really nice. But right here is the cap, and there are the little air holes, and there are the holes where the material comes through. This is what a lot of people miss, even out at the club, because I took apart a guy's gun because he said it wasn't working that well. He was having problems with it. I said, well, give me some lacquer thinner. And I keep saying lacquer thinner, but you can use other cleaning solvents. So I took it all apart, cleaned it. I washed out all of the ports. I cleaned out all these little pinholes, and this thing worked perfectly fine when I was done. So it's just a matter of maintenance and just knowing that that's what you need to do, and you'll keep your spray gun performing incredibly well. Now, there's one method I use because somebody said, well, how do you set the fan on this? To how you want it. I open up the fan setting all the way, so I got this big, huge fan, and I'm spraying it on a piece of cardboard. I make a couple of passes, then I start turning it in, and that pattern will start to go like this. And then that's how pretty much, at me as a DIYer, intermittent user, that's how I set that pattern. Works fine, works perfectly fine every time. And I also will adjust that material volume control at the same time so that I know In the case of like water, it's going to be about pretty close to the same consistency as most varnishes and lacquers and stuff. So I can get a really nice pattern. I know my gun is set between 35 and 40 working pressure down on the bottom. And so I've got my fan set and I have my volume set. And the other one down at the bottom, like I said, I leave it wide open. And this gun is right here. I just leave that open, and the other controls, like I said, between the PSI and so forth, you don't really need that one anyway, so just leave it wide open. That's what I do. I'm sure it'll work for you if you want to try it. On the volume control, how do I know how to set it? Well, when you screw it in, that's less volume. When you screw it the other way, you're going to get more volume. It's that easy, and if you're spraying it on cardboard or something, you'll see what I mean in 2 seconds. Now, there is a preventative tip on all guns, whether you get them at the big box or whether you're buying them online. The other thing you want to do, take it apart and clean it with a solvent. These things are shipped with different kind of rust prevention solvents, and who knows when they were manufactured. Clean the heck out of it. And I keep saying, like I said, lacquer thinner or whatever solvent. Paint thinner is fine. Mineral spirits, whatever. Use something like that, but clean it real well before you use it to keep the contaminants out that were used in the manufacturing process. Okay, so what size hose do I use? Well, in the garage, I use hobby sprayers, so I can get away with 1/4 inch air hose. Not for this. 3/8. 3/8 will serve you well. I don't use anything less than that. Somebody can argue and say, well, they do, it works fine. Not for me. 3/8. 3/8 is the standard, I believe. And you're going to have so much less problem and better control over what you're spraying if you use 3/8. All compressors have a water trap, so make sure every 2 or 3 times that you're using it that you open it up and you drain out all that condensation and water out of your compressor. That doesn't mean it's all gone. It's still going to pump it through the lines and your hose and everything else. So that's the reason why you probably want to hook up a good filtration system, at some point, so that you don't get all of that. But, that's up to you. There are different configurations. I explained to you mine. It isn't that expensive. Get a dedicated air hose and make sure you put filters in line. That's the biggest thing. You want to filter it, or you're going to end up getting, condensation in that line, and it's going to end up in your gun. You're going to have fisheye on wood, and when you're spraying paint, you're going to have all kinds of problems, and you're going to blame it on the gun. But a lot of times it's really not the gun. It's just in how you created your setup. These things, the pressure regulator, the disposable filters, and even the gun, they are not expensive. And this is one of the handiest tools that I have, especially when it comes to painting or any kind of finish work. Okay, I'm the Home Handyman. I hope you click subscribe. I hope you keep following me. If nothing else, draw this diagram and you'll remember what each one of those controls are for, and you can actually go try it yourself. I hope you click subscribe. I hope you keep following me. I'll see you on the next video. Don't forget, all the links are below. Please use the links. I'm not selling anything, but if you use the links, I make a little bit that helps fund doing these videos, and it feeds my stray cats, and I would appreciate it. Thank you, folks. Bye-bye.